earlier in the year, I started showing some work that I've been doing about nowcasting the Australian economy. One of the great problems about the Australian economy is that we don't have publicly available indicators such as the Chicago Fed National Activity Indicator, which is something that the Fed has been producing for years and we've been talking about as a really good gauge of the US economy. And we don't have things like the Federal Reserve of Atlanta nowcasting, which has only been produced for the last couple of years, but it's enormously useful in telling us where the US economy is. For example, this year the Federal Reserve thinks that the US economy will grow by 7%. Yes, I did say 7%. And in terms of the most recent nowcast for the US economy that's available on the Federal Reserve of Atlanta's website, they think that in the June quarter, the US economy is growing faster than that. It's growing at a rate of 7.6% annualised. In Australian terms, that means that the US economy will add 1.8% will have added 1.8% of GDP in the second quarter. But we haven't got that in Australia, and there's been a number of attempts over the years by the NAB, for example, or by the most recent major attempt was by the Commonwealth Bank in terms of a joint venture with IHS, which has produced a composite CPI, composite PMI for the Australian economy. But none of these efforts seem to be able to capture the unique structure of the Australian economy as a big resource economy together with a service economy. Perhaps a little bit like Canada, but totally unlike anywhere else, totally unlike the US or totally unlike European economies, where economists normally do their work and for which GDP was designed. So what we decided to do was do an entirely new project and try and build this nowcast piece by piece. And where we started with this was employment. And we found that we could do a reasonable job of this by using the ABS measures of employment and the ABS measures of hours worked. And it's pretty interesting what those numbers show for where we've gone over the past period. Back in the beginning of 2019, there was about 12.7 million people in jobs in Australia, and before the pandemic really hit the Australian economy, that had gone up to 13 million, which is, it was almost exactly 13 million in March last year. It then fell precipitously to below 12.2 million people in jobs as the economy shut down, and then is now almost 1 million workers higher than the low where it was last year. And so the most recent number for jobs in Australia in June was 13,154,000. So we've added, we're about 150,000 jobs more than the very peak employment level before the pandemic. So we've recovered from the pandemic and then some, and now we're recovering at a particular rate. If we look at hours worked, which is the other component of our model, the all-time record high for hours worked in the Australian economy for any month was the month of May that's just behind us, and there was 1.81 billion hours worked in the Australian economy, and that came off slightly in June to 1.87 billion. We put those two together in a model, and that gives us growth, we think, for the second quarter in the Australian economy, 1.4%. We think that as opposed to US growth of 7%, the Australian economy will grow by 5.3% this year. That means it has to grow by about 1.3% a quarter. To be able to do that, we think we've certainly beat that in the first quarter with 1.8% growth, and we think we'll beat it again in the second quarter with 1.4% growth. I've spoken to some economists that have higher estimates for the second quarter than that. What is shutdown effect on the Australian economy? Well, before the shutdown, which beginning this quarter, I'd estimated that growth this quarter would be 1.2% and growth next quarter would be 1.1%. Really, it's impossible to estimate what the effective shutdown effect is upon the Australian economy. But what we do know, and what we've been able to demonstrate, that any growth we lose from shutdown will be added immediately the shutdown is over. So if any reduction in growth this quarter will be added back next quarter, I've assumed, and this is entirely a guess, that as opposed to my previous estimate of 1.2% growth for this quarter, we'll lose about 70 basis points of growth this quarter, which means that you'll still have positive growth by about 50 basis points. That'll all be added back next quarter, and we'll have a whopping growth of 1.7%, which would be almost equal to the surprise shock upside number of 1.8% in the first quarter. So, but we really don't know what the slowdown will be. But the result of this is that we think we'll grow 1.4%. We did grow 1.4% in the second quarter, which puts us in line for our 5.3% target, better than in line for our 5.3% target for the full year. And we'll grow fast enough in the next two quarters to meet that number too. But whether the growth is in this quarter or next quarter depends very much upon the behaviour of state politicians between now and then.